Hey, everybody, and welcome to The Brand Called You. Listen, on April 5th, I'm going to do what I've always done my whole life. I'm going to dutifully get in my car and drive to New Jersey to spend the Jewish holiday of Passover with my relatives. Now, this was always my favorite holiday, and I'll tell you why. I love to see the cousins, right? And I loved the rituals of Passover. There were some really funky rituals. I mean, this is a holiday in which Jews all over the world are commanded to retell the story of the biblical exodus out of Egypt, of Moses leading the Israelites from slavery to freedom. And with it came some really interesting rituals. For example, we're commanded to eat bitter herbs, which represent the sadness of slaves, and charosis, which is a date and raisin mix, which represents the mortar of the pyramids and slavery. But my favorite ritual of all was pouring the cup of wine for Elijah the prophet. Now, every year it was the same. My father would go over to the living room and take down this Kiddush cup from the bookcase, and he would stick it on the table, which was covered in a beautiful white tablecloth. And then he would pour so much Manischewitz grape wine into it that it would spill on the tablecloth. And my mother would say, "George, watch it." And then he would go to the door and he would open it up for Elijah to come in so he could drink from our glass of wine. And I couldn't for the life of me figure out how he knew what exit on Route 3 in Clifton to get off at. But I was absolutely convinced that Elijah had drunk from that cup of wine. It had receded a few inches by the end of the meal. And it was fun. But the one thing I never questioned ever throughout my childhood was the actual story. I think I just somehow took it for truth. And yet, since that time, a lot has happened. There has been a huge body of literature and a huge body of thinking and rethinking the story of Exodus. Did it really happen archaeologically, physically, spiritually? If not, what is its metaphoric meaning? And that's what I want to do today. I want to explore Exodus in its most creative metaphoric fashion. And I can't think of two better people to do that with than my guest today. So let me introduce them to you. Zev Shanken studied biblical texts at Northwestern University, Hebrew University, and Jewish Theological Seminary before becoming a literature teacher. And for 25 years, he went up to some of the worst neighborhoods in New York, from the Bronx to Brooklyn to Washington Heights, and he opened the hearts and minds of high school students and excited them to literature. And while he was doing that, he would run home after school and he would teach Hebrew high school, and even got a gig teaching literature, biblical literature, at Keene College in New Jersey. He has published 2 books of poetry. And in addition, some of his work is coming out in a new book called Jewels, teasing out the poetry in Jewish humor and stories. Zev, we're very excited to have you. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Laura Sims is an internationally known storyteller whose original works combine traditional stories with personal narratives. She has authored 5 books, including her latest, which she's just finishing now, which uses a Romanian folktale as the basis for an autobiographical exploration of her life. She's won numerous awards for recordings, writings, and her performances worldwide. She even has worked for Rutgers University Peace Institute and actually saved a zoo in Romania, among her other many, many talents. Laura grew up in Borough Park, Brooklyn, and she is the great daughter of the Grand Rabbi of Moldavia, for whom she is named. Welcome, Zev, and welcome, Laura. I couldn't be more excited to have you with me today. So thank you.
Thank you.
So listen, before we start to dissect the story of Exodus, for those listeners that might not know, I'm going to just do an extremely, extremely fast recap. The story that we're commanded to tell every year basically starts with God commanding Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, out of slavery, and into freedom. And he gets blowback from the Egyptian leader, Pharaoh, right? Pharaoh says, no way. And God, he doesn't like that. So he sends down a bunch of creepy plagues like frogs and locusts and murrain, whatever that is. He throws down a burning bush. He turns a sea into a river of blood, a snake, a staff into a snake. And it culminates with the ultimate story, the parting of the Red Sea where the Israelis cross, and when the Egyptians follow, they get drowned. And suddenly the Israelites find themselves free at last. Or are they? Because they have to spend the next 40 years wandering the desert before they make it into the promised land. So that's the basic story in a 2-second nutshell. So now I have to ask you all, does this story fascinate you as much as it does me? And if so, well, I guess I want to start by asking, what is your modern Exodus story? What is your take on Exodus? What is your personal Exodus? What does it mean to make Exodus in a modern sense? And I guess I'll start with you, Zev.
The first question about whether it really happened or not, to me is irrelevant, because the story is what counts. And if it really happened, it happened 4,000 years ago. So I don't know how much that really matters. What matters is that the idea that slaves can liberate themselves is planted in your brain. And whether it happened really or not, the fact that slaves, underdogs, can win is one of the great messages of Passover. And it starts with the character of Moses. And when I was going to do this, I started thinking about that. And Moses is an underdog completely. He is raised in Pharaoh's house because he was supposed to be killed, but Pharaoh's mother, I'll get to that in a minute. The important thing is, I don't mean Pharaoh's mother, I mean Moses' mother. The important thing is that the first thing we see Moses do as an adult is stick up for the underdog. He sees an Egyptian beating an Israelite, and he kills the Egyptian. Now, he was dressed he was an Egyptian. He was adopted by Pharaoh's family. And he basically was a prince. He was Pharaoh's daughter's child. And yet he stuck up for the underdog. The next day, he goes out and he sees two Israelites arguing. And he says, why are you arguing? And the guy says to him, are you going to do to me like you did the Egyptian? Are you going to kill me like you did the Egyptian? And then Moses realizes that he's been found out. Now, let me just, as an example of Bible, it's literature. It took me 10 minutes to say 4 short sentences in the Bible. I'm going to read the actual text. It won't bore you, really, listen. Now, it was some years later, Moses grew up. He went out to his brothers and saw their burdens. He saw an Egyptian man striking a Hebrew man, one of his brothers. He turned this way and that way, and seeing that there was no man there, he struck down the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. He went out again the next day, and here two Hebrew men scuffling. He said to the guilty one, for what reason do you strike your fellow? He said, who made you prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Moses became afraid and said, surely the matter is known. Pharaoh heard of this matter and sought to kill Moses. So, first thing that Moses does as a hero is stick up for the underdog and try to have the fellow slaves unify. This is not the case with other heroes. Other heroes, the first thing they do in other ancient cultures is they'll slay 100 lions with one hand, or they're great hunters. But here, this hero is sticking out. The second thing he does, he runs to Midian to get away from Pharaoh, and he defends the women at the well who are being bullied by these men who come by. And he kicks them away. And he defends the women. Again, the underdog. And the woman, one of the women, goes to her father and says, this lovely Egyptian man saved us, and then says, bring him here, and he arranges the marriage, and that's how Moses marries the daughter of the priest of Midian, the high priest of Midian. The point is, Forget the fact that it's arranged marriage. The point is that the values that Moses encompasses, sticking up for the underdog, risking his life for it, doing the right thing, is what, and this is all before he's been told to liberate the Jews. He becomes a shepherd for the priest of Midian. And then he sees the burning bush, and that's when God tells him to go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. But his character is already shown as somebody who has this caring, even with all his power. They say Jews live like Episcopalians and vote like Baptists, you know? In other words, we are wealthy like Pharaoh's son, Moses, an adopted son, was wealthy, but Moses did not understand it that way. He understood his responsibilities to the weak. So that's my take on it. That's my personal take on the story. And that's I like it.
I always thought his compassion was motivated by the fact that he was ripped away from his mother as a young child. And he was it was like the hypersensitivity of a traumatized child.
Very
but
good.
Whatever the reason, I think it's a really good value. I don't know, Laura, does that resonate with you, or do you have a different take?
Of course, it resonates with me. It is the story that I grew up with, and how I was told to think of this story where Moses was such an extraordinary human being. And of course, I was born in 1947 when, all the Jews were seeking haven after the Holocaust in Palestine, which became Israel. And so I had an experience in a synagogue in Botoșani in northern Romania that brought back the story of Exodus. Like you, Lisa, I loved Passover. Not only the meal, and I got to drink wine, but I loved the singing and the telling of the story. And I dreaded through the entire Seder one of the stories of four brothers. The word ass for donkey was there in the text. And so I was terrified that I would have to say it because I was a laugher. And somehow, karmically, it always came to me. And so I would spit the word out, in which my brother would roar with laughter. Anyway, and also I, of course, loved the little glass of wine that went to Elijah, because that was the magic of the world. That was the magic of the world. And I loved the song, Lishana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. So in the synagogue in Botoșani, which is a miraculous story in itself, one of old synagogue with a domed ceiling that was somehow looked to me, in my 40s, like a Turkish palace from a fairy tale. It was beautiful. And suddenly the chazan of the synagogue, and also the head of the small Jewish community, there were only something like 36 Jews left in Botoșani, appeared. And we conversed in this kind of mishmash of Yiddish, Hebrew, German, French, and Romanian, somehow understanding each other. And leaving the synagogue, he walked me back to the hotel, the only hotel in Botoșani at the time. And I was able to ask him, why did he not leave when most of the Jews left and went to Palestine or somewhere else, like to their relatives, on my street in Borough Park in Brooklyn? And he said, Jerusalem is a place you long for in your heart.
Mm.
And when it is a literal place, then there is only violence and conflict.
Oh.
It was such a miraculous thing, and I had recorded it as well because I wasn't sure I understood everything. And it really opened the doors of my looking, as Zev said, at this not as a historical text, but as a story.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, as an older woman now, I don't see the Egyptians politically as, actual enemies, or even in the story, but it is, an old story, and therefore it is a story that is new again and again in the telling. And for me, with this old man's statement, Lishana Haba Yerushalayim, became the way in which through song I could long for that sense of continuity before I was a slave to beliefs, to biases, to succumbing to how I should live as a woman under the thumb of conditional patriarchy in a world committed to this split between the spirit, the holy, and the ordinary. So for me, the story of Exodus is a sort of brilliant archetypal story of reuniting, reconnecting with the divine, with that which exists not subliminally, but self-existing, unconditional continuity of life and death. So and also song is a big part of it, because it is Miriam, the sister of Moses, for me, who became the main character, because she was so she's mentioned but almost forgotten, the one who sings after the Jews pass through this tunnel, like the coming from the womb, and what is obstacle is swallowed. Moses sings, of course, in this patriarchal world, because Moses sings, I'm praising God. But then Miriam takes up the drum and has all the women dance with their ancient history of the Jewish prophetesses, and they rouse up the longing, and they don't interrupt this thing with me, but just praise God, praise the divine. And so this union at that moment between this that is happening, in Judaism, that marked, maybe even sometimes aroused such brilliance and inspiration in my life, but scarred my life, of this deep separation between what is masculine and feminine, what is alive and what is sacred, and so forth. In this is the possibility of union that, to me, is subliminally in this story, that now after all these years, I'm looking forward this year to the Seder, and not necessarily for the meal, but for what is so often forgotten, which is what you said you loved, Lisa, and of course, Zev, you too, the story and the ritual. What really is there? I can listen to it without the bias and the hurt that I felt as a young girl.
Although I'm still tortured by one part of that story that isn't the Exodus, it's actually what happens afterwards. So after all those struggles, God has them wind up in a desert wandering for 40 years. And this seemed so cruel to me, and I struggle with this part of the story. As the child of a Holocaust survivor who was grew up, kind of with a victimized mentality, for years I was convinced that it took Moses 40 years because he led the Israelites walking out of Egypt backwards, because as Jews, we like to walk into the future while focusing on the horrors of the past. But now I'm seeing it a little differently. Obviously, I think physical change does not imply psychological change, and it takes longest time to catch up. The heart and the mind and the body do not operate often at the same time. And I also have come to see that 40-year desert as a sort of way of, in my own mind, catching up on. I kind of have often felt enslaved by my own limited self-belief, and I think it's taken me the better part of 40 years to realize that I have the ability to do things that I didn't know I did, that I'm competent, that I get to stand at a man's table. All these kinds of things, I think, took a desert for me to figure out. So lately, I'm thinking of it more as a personal enslavement and a catching up time. But I'd love to hear your take on why 40 years in the desert after being liberated. So, Zev?
Well, the tradition, I remember it being said that it was easy to get the Jews, the Israelites, out of slavery, but it was harder to get slavery out of the Israelites.
Yeah.
And they're thinking all the time, they're longing for the flesh pots of Egypt after they're kicked out, when they leave. And what I noticed going over the story in preparation for this is that even from the beginning, the Israelites are doubting and argumentative. Moses knows this. He says to God before he even goes, the burning bush, he says, are they going to believe me? Not Pharaoh's going to believe me. I know that part. I had forgotten, though. He also says, the Israelites are not going to believe me. Who am I? Because I don't speak well.
Right.
So already there was this understanding that there's a certain mentality that slaves have that does not let them realize themselves, actualize themselves, if you want to use more modern terms. And that's what took 40 years. He had to get slavery out of them.
Yeah, Zev,
and the climax of that story is in Bamidbar, Numbers, the book that comes after. There's the famous story of the spies. Moses sends 12 spies, one from each tribe, into Canaan to spy out the land to see, we're going to conquer it. We got to figure stuff out. They come back and 10 of them say, these guys are giants. We can't do it. It's not going to work. Forget about it. Let's go back to Egypt. 2 of the spies say, no, we can do it. We can go in there, and they're strong, but we can do it. It's beautiful. That's Joshua and Caleb ben Yefuneh, I think. I know Joshua was one of them. And that's why Joshua was rewarded to become the next leader. But most of them still had slave mentality. That story for me is profound. That part, that spy story. When I worked in civil rights, I was in the Freedom Summer, 1965, and I would go to churches in Orangeburg, South Carolina, and try to black churches and to have the congregants go to register to vote. That was the big problem, having them register to vote. And we would give speeches. I would go with another guy who became a Hasidic rabbi, actually. But we would try to inspire them to go and vote. And we talked about, how we are Israelites too, and blah, blah, blah. Coming back, I heard on the radio a black preacher give a speech, and he gave that speech about the spies. And he said, we have to be like the 2 spies who said, it is a difficult job, but we want our freedom. We want to be able to do it, and we can do it even though it's high. And the 10 spies who said we can't do it, they were punished in the desert, biblical language, but the 2 spies who said we can do it, that's what it takes. And that's to me the power of the story, that in all the cases it's really saying, be strong and brave, rak chazak ve'ematz. Only be strong and brave. That's what you have to do. And the Seder itself, well, we'll talk about that later, but go ahead.
No, but Zev, you reminded me when you were talking about the 40 years in the desert. When I was researching something for the Museum of the City of New York, where I used to be a storyteller, I came across a story about a guy named Meyer Noah in 50 years before Herzl. I think it was 1880, something like 1884. I don't remember exactly, but he basically believed that the Jews needed their own homeland, but that they weren't psychologically ready yet because they'd been so persecuted. They needed to practice. And he bought vast tracts of land in Buffalo, New York, and named it Ararat after Noah's Ark. And Thomas Jefferson came to the opening, but it never took off. It never took off. And then, of course, Israel happened 50 years later, but it turns out he probably was right about needing to practice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So Laura, what about you? The desert.
Actually, now when I hear you two conversing and I have this wonderful conversation, I think this is the heart of the telling of the story at the Seder. This is the conversation that is provoked when you engage in this ritual of exploring on all different levels and all different ways the nature of liberation from slavery. And so thank you. This is really...
Unless of course you attend a Seder in New Jersey, in which case it doesn't often happen to this extent, but
Exactly. I mean, this has never happened. Even at a feminist Seder I was invited to in San Francisco, where they had rewritten the Haggadah. This is not necessarily the conversation, but I agree. I think that there is a moment of revelation, a moment of recognition, when you sense that there is the possibility of liberation. But as we all know in our lives, as you said, the ability to live with that, from under, inside your bones, is an obstacle. And we're constantly wanting to rush back to what we know, to what's familiar. And so that's where the 40 years in the desert, also, having studied at some point Tibetan Buddhism, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, particularly when my brother was dying, there is this period of time called the bardo between your actual consciousness leaving your body. You're liberated from all obstacles of desire and preoccupations and separations and isolation. And in that period of time, you confront all the aspects of your mind in these kind of visualizations that occur over this kind of random number of 49 days, but it could be 40 days. Also, in a lot of literature in that time, 40 was always meaning a long time or a lot. But so coming to recognize that you can live with no body, to be no body, to be consumed with the divine, to be is the goal of liberation, where I think Martin Luther King was an advocate of speaking of this all the time, the heart of all spirituality, to liberate ourselves from this kind of imposed hatred and biases of all kinds inside of us. That and that's where it occurs first, thus the retelling of a story as a feast.
Beautiful. I love that. So let me ask both of you the question that I started with, which is, if you had to talk about your personal exodus today, what enslaves you, and what your personal exodus today, what would it be? Any ideas, Laura?
Well, there are so many. I think at present, one of the great personal exoduses for me is to transcend my physical outrage, not the outrage, but my physical bias against what is happening at the world and in the world, and seek something more rooted so that I can have the wisdom to transform aggression in the world rather than to add to aggression in the world through my own outrage at aggression.
It's funny because it seems like your personal exodus is also the very thing that fascinates you about the Exodus story in general, right?
It does. And I was very influenced by a book that I came upon accidentally, a thick book called Reflections on Exodus by Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg. Do you know, her work?
Amazing.
It's called The Particulars of Rapture. And I just find it brilliant because it brings together for me the inherent, oftentimes submerged wisdom of Judaism, the feminine submerged wisdom of Judaism, and the logic, the devotion of Moses and all other cultures in the world.
Yeah, on the feminist part of it, the Everett Fox points out that in the beginning of the story of the Moses story, women are predominant. They're the ones who are they're Shifra and Puah. These are the midwives who say we can't kill the babies because the Jewish women they have their birth so quickly. By the time we get there, the babies are already born. We can't kill the baby. Then there's Miriam. There's Moses' mother, and there's Pharaoh's daughter. All of these characters, and then there's Tzipporah, Moses' wife, who basically saves his life because Moses forgets to circumcise his children. So his two sons, he's going back to Egypt. So these are all women play major roles in the development of his character and in the story. And then in the Haggadah, they say they only have one thing about this. They mention that the women would bring food to the when we were slaves and we were told to we couldn't use straw to make bricks. I think that was the problem. Pharaoh made it really difficult for us. So the women, so we had to stay there all night long. So we couldn't sleep with the women. So the women would come out and bring us food and sleep with us. They would come to us and sleep with us. That's how they could propagate the Jewish people, you see. So that's the only way that the Haggadah gives mention to it. But the Haggadah is written much later than the Exodus story, and I think the Exodus story is much more feminine than the rabbis have taken it to be.
So Zev,
but the point I wanted to make about my own personal Exodus, I was thinking about this from when you told me this would be one of the questions, and it kept on going back to adolescence and late adolescence, and I realized that is the way that it's often explained, that you have to leave your parents' house, and that's the Exodus, and you go into your own way of seeing it. But now I'm old, and I'm trying to find I've already overcome that stuff, right? For whatever, either did it well or badly, I overcame the fact of leaving my parents' house and all the difficulties of adolescence and that. But the new thing now is going from adulthood to old agehood, an exodus also. And there is a transition. In other words, and what transition should I be making now? You were born in 47, I was born in 45. So, Laura, you said you were born in 47. So, I'm 77 years old. I'm going clearly into old age, if I'm not already. And I have to re-examine now the Exodus story, not as a last rite of puberty, becoming an adult, but what slavery as a working human being did I have that now perhaps I'm liberated from? And this doesn't mean, finally go on that cruise that you were waiting for, but there are things now as at end of life. How can I make the exodus, not to death, but just to old age? What new ways that I see the world and I see life and my friends and all my values. How do I make the exodus from that into an old age, a smooth transition into old age? In other words, I'm looking at the exodus as a transition from adulthood into old age and trying to see it that way.
Any of the old age stories of the old age characters in the Bible kind of inform your approach?
Well, Solomon certainly not. David, perhaps. There are two accounts of his deathbed. One is kind of okay, and the other one, he just wants to settle all the accounts. He just go after this guy and that guy, and he wants it all revenge. Isaac is another old age story that we have, right? And he's just tricked. he's stupid, or maybe he's not. That's one of the theories that he was going on. But I'm trying to think of successful old age, old people.
Sarah gives birth at 99.
Right. Yeah. But that's just saying that she's not really old. No, I'm talking about old. That's saying she wasn't really old because she gave birth. All right, But
no. I think
as far as old age mentality is what I'm thinking.
What do you mean? What do you mean, Laura? What do you mean?
I think that it's a story. So therefore, the old woman gives birth. So, I mean, what we're doing with these very, very different perceptions here of how one reads a story, which is what happens. This is the beauty of it. For me, she represents the old woman, the great birth mother of pre-Neolithic history, who gives birth, who brings new life out of old age, which is another way of seeing, as you're saying, of this story of Exodus at this time in our life, of seeing the movement toward sort of the ultimate liberation, which could be considered death. And one thing that I've been thinking about, because I've been writing this piece, which is, on this Romanian fairy tale, as a sort of vehicle for talking about my whole life. And I realize I keep reiterating throughout these astonishing events that happened, sort of magical events that happened in my life. And because I'm so, all the meditation practice and scholarship and everything else that I've done, blah, blah, I still will so easily forget that. But seeing them all reminds me of those 40 years, and the fact that's barely mentioned is that what allowed people to survive 40 years in this wasteland, as least seen in the story desert as wasteland, is the sort of holy water producing capacity of the prophetess, priestess Miriam, who creates from stone water, who makes springs appear in wells in the middle of the desert. So I'm at this point in my life trying to look back to these incidents where it's almost, like God speaking to Moses and saying, hey, I'm here, and Moses not getting it, and then, hey, I'm burning the bush, hey, this, that, the other. That there is this quality in the world that we have completely ignored, the magic of the world, and which reconnects us to sort of the continuity of the divine in reality, in our material reality. So I've been thinking about that a lot, of honoring and revisioning those stories, not as like, wow, that was really incredible, and then forgetting about it and going on to some kind of obsessive compulsive behavior that this would be.
Yeah. Well, so we have time for one more question, and this is another one that haunts me. Why was Moses not allowed to go with the Israelites into the promised land? What do you think, Zev? Your own interpretation.
My own. I don't have any unique interpretation. The interpretation is usually his death place is deliberately vague, so that they wouldn't make a shrine out of it. So no claim it. No tribe could claim that that's where it was. The other interpretation is, of course, it didn't exist anyway, and they didn't want to have to. Once he got into Israel, they would start asking questions about where. So, but getting back to the idea of the transition, you see, what interested me in Laura's understanding of it was that these are really, in some ways, denials of old age. I mean, in old age, you can't, 99-year-olds can't have children. And the point is, there should be something in life besides that. That's the point, you see. As an adult, at a certain time, the idea is to reproduce. But when you get to an age when the goal is not that. The goal is not to bear fruit. The goal is something else. Maybe wisdom. That's what I'm looking for. And so I'm looking in the story for images, metaphors, symbols that can stand for that. A valuable life that doesn't mean reproducing. A valuable life that doesn't mean reproducing, but something that
To me,
makes
that's
not death. It's
I
old
think
age, not death. Yeah.
giving birth,
I
giving birth
don't
to
know where.
ideas, giving birth to
What?
ideas, giving birth to ideas, parenting, friends and family and community. I mean, you're talking about the plight of the childless woman.
No, but I don't. Yeah, but I don't want. I don't. You say giving birth to new ideas for old age. No, I don't. I want a valuable old age that doesn't include giving birth, because that's youth. You see, what I want is not to say it's not really old because you're giving birth just like you're young. No, I want it to be you're not giving birth anymore, but there's other values in it, and that's what I'm looking for in the story. I don't know if it's in the Bible. I know it's in the in the Talmud. You know, you have the wise old man Chazal Chachmeinu Zichrono Livracha, Pirkei Avot. You know, we have the tradition of the wise people. But you asked for Bible stories that have it, and I don't know. Maybe that's one of the things the rabbis did. The rabbis saved Judaism for old people.
What Zev? What are?
Can I interrupt here, because you asked two questions and I think they're really related, and so interesting to hear you speak. Because for me, as a storyteller, not a storyteller, I'm very entertaining actually on stage, but it's in service of transmission of something.
Yeah,
and
right.
For me, the story is always symbolic, because when you hear the story, you're imagining it. So hence you imagined it as you do, Zev and Lisa, myself, and billions of other people. I never really thought about, contemplated Moses not going to the Holy Land, or the land of this new arising of relationship to God, according to the Bible. But suddenly it strikes me something very powerful, that in another way, maybe contemporaneously, I could see this in praise of the masculine. I'm not talking about men and women so much literally, but I'm talking about masculine and feminine principles in the world. Because when you imagine, you're everything in the story. So all Moses and Miriam, everybody, they're like your dream characters arising. Perhaps it's a warning that we need to unite within Moses, the masculine and the feminine, for him to be able to enter and make this truly a holy land. But the fierce patriarchal idea of separation, the idea that can't see symbolism as really the harvest of a deep understanding, it causes so many issues in our world today: the blindness to climate change, the increasing bias against others. These are sicknesses of a parched mind that is not a mind connected to heart mind. So I think there's almost, in the Jungian sense, the beauty of waiting, longing for the Moses in each of us to be moisturized by the well of the feminine, so that he can enter and that union can occur, and we might be liberated in a more almost magical, not magic in la-di-da fantasy, but the sort of alchemical way in which we gain wisdom to see beyond our own opinions.
That's good.
I've never thought of this before, but thank you so much, Zev.
That's good. Yeah, thank you. That's good.
Yeah, that is a good one. Moisturized by the well of feminism.
The feminine, because feminist means, one, it has the aggression to it, but feminine is the nature, the principles, like day and life, like water and earth, like the holy and the material, death and life. There is within all of it some continuity that we have been taught to ignore. And so when I say that, yes, I think that the 99-year-old woman gave birth, I'm not talking about gave birth in a material way. It's not. It's in old age one gives birth to wisdom. But to say that is abstract. But to be involved in an image, in a story, is to awaken in yourself all of
Right.
the.
I see.
But,
Yeah.
you know, you just reminded me though that men can give birth, men can get a woman pregnant at 99. So there actually is a perfect example of the feminine and the masculine entwined in one character, right?
Yeah.
They're still fertile at 99.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some.
But listen, I could obviously go on and on for another 2 hours with both of you. I don't know where the time went. We didn't even get to the burning bush, but I just want to thank you so much for your thoughts and really wish both of you a wonderful holiday. I can't wait to see where both of your journeys take you. And also wishing you great food on Passover.
I think, Lisa, I think we did get to the burning bush, because I think that's what Laura was saying, that the bush keeps burning. You know, it's not consumed; it keeps radiating, and that's the point. So maybe that is the case for old age too. So it's a good way to end it. Thank you very much. I enjoyed this.
And may this be what happens at the end of the Seder, after all differing ideas and views are brought together, that we pour another glass of wine.
And we say the Son of Yerushalayim, whichever that is, literally or spiritually, next year in Jerusalem.
Lift up the drum and long for what's real.
Both so much. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.